Hi, my name is Kristin Christman, and I'll be reading to you the final part, part 4, of the memo I was asked to write in June of this year about the consequences of apartheid in Israel. This part 4 I'll call Paradigm for Peace Recommendations. And I'll give the final consequence number 16, Growth in Anti-Semitism. In this memo, I described 16 consequences, negative consequences of supporting apartheid in Israel. And the final one here is growth in anti-Semitism. But before I go into that, just to remind everybody, here's the map of Israel and the violence, the war that's going on right now is in Gaza. These purple areas are the occupied territories that Israel took in the 1967 war and is illegally occupying. These are the Golan Heights of Syria. The West Bank, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River here, that's where Palestinians are being, they're losing their homes, they're being bulldozed down. And the Gaza Strip, where the war is now, where 2.3 million people, Palestinians, live in the Gaza Strip. And since 2007, so for 16 years, Israel, the government of Israel, has imposed a blockade around Gaza. So people can't even count on getting water and electricity. So it's been a terrible, extremely terrible situation, and I think some people have a lot of nerve in saying that Hamas's attack of October 7th was unprovoked. I mean, how would you feel if your family had been in a blockade for 16 years? Growth in anti-Semitism. For many critics of Israel, their anger and disgust arise not from anti-Semitism, but from the creation of the State of Israel and the way in which it was created, and the nature of Israel's relationship with the United States as either a U.S. colony or possibly the reverse, a U.S. master. Such critics do not feel hatred for Jewish people, Jewish values, or Jewish religion, but rather disgust and rage towards the state of Israel, towards the government, how it behaves unjustly and brutally, and how it was created with utter disdain, contempt, and injustice towards the Arabs living within its borders, as well as disdain towards the many Jews who didn't agree with the Zionist goal of creating a Jewish state, and disdain towards those Jewish Zionists who didn't agree with militant or selfish Zionism. As mentioned earlier, when the idea of creating Israel in the land where the Palestinians lived was first considered, many Jews, especially the Jews already living in Palestine, were alarmed and were convinced that such a move would harm their relations with Palestinians and increase anti-Semitism worldwide. If the U.S. government continues to tacitly support the Israeli government system of apartheid and violations of international law, if the U.S. government continues to buckle under to the money offered by AIPAC, such behavior will only increase anti-Semitism. Because the truth is, a tremendous amount of horrible anti-Semitism still exists, and Jews are scapegoated as being responsible for many of the world's problems. I see anti-Semitic comments, for example, on websites online, and I am appalled. If any such comments appear on my own YouTube channel about Russia and Ukraine, I respond to them immediately with kindness but in disagreement, and with additional information to try to help people distinguish between the broad Jewish population and the extremist revisionists that we've spoken of in earlier parts. I don't banish or condemn these commenters, because that would never help them feel listened to and never help them change. But I do respond so that others too can see my comments. In particular, many anti-Semites believe that powerful Jews are behind the scenes, rigging the political and economic systems into what they are today. AIPAC's ability to have such power over the U.S. Congress only confirms the beliefs of people who hate Jews and fear their power. And we talked about IPAC in part 3. The American Israel, I think it stood for Public Affairs Committee, and their extreme influence over U.S. government policy. Let me just look it up. Yeah, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, IPAC. So IPAC's ability to have this power only confirms the beliefs of people who hate Jews and fear their power. For anti-Semites, they won't be able to distinguish between people in IPAC and the vast majority of Jews who are not power-hungry and who likely want peace and cooperation with Palestinians. Those with prejudice, including anti-Semites, tend to think categorically. It's the nature of the thinking. And they'll instead view all Jews as evil, worthy of scorn, abuse, and death. IPAC's alarming degree of power over the U.S. political system and foreign policy could make even non-prejudiced persons become anti-Semitic. The U.S. government, in fact, from what I've read, there have been a lot of anti-Semitic events in the United States recently since the Israel-Gaza war, out of anger against Israel. See, but it's doing, the American Jewish people aren't responsible for that, and most Israeli Jewish people wouldn't want that either. But they're getting blamed for it. The U.S. government, if it truly cares about the Jewish population, should not cave in to the predilections of that thin sliver of the Jewish population whose goals not only thwart those of the general Jewish population, but also give all Jews a bad name and an unfriendly world in which to live. I would also add that the U.S. government is behaving inconsistently towards Jews and pretending to be pro-Jew by being pro-Israel, and then supporting a Ukrainian government that is in league with ultra-nationalist Ukrainians, including neo-Nazis, who are anti-Semitic, who say abusive, hateful comments towards Jews, who wish Hitler had killed all Jews, who want Jews out of Ukraine, who praise past Ukrainian leaders who murdered Jews during World War II, who paint swastikas on public buildings and who vandalize Jewish memorials. This behavior is documented by human rights organizations, by the UN. Even Israel has spoken out against the post-coup Ukraine government's anti-Semitism. So I'm showing how the U.S. government is being inconsistent. On the other hand, the U.S. government is being consistent in that its pro-Israel stance is not actually pro-Jewish. It is only pro the powerful leaders in power who will be allies with the U.S. government. Similarly, in Ukraine, the U.S. is pro the powerful leaders in power who will be allies with the U.S. government and do its bidding. The U.S. government must not make alliances based upon selfish interests and deals to scratch each other's back in ways that harm others. These alliances of convenience are not based upon principles of morality or law. Americans would take pride in their government if it would actually stand consistently for principles of humanity, 360 degrees of empathy and truth, impartial adherence to international law, caring for the planet, and cooperative dialogue with all people, shutting no one out. Alliances can then be based upon shared commitment to these principles, including the principle of working to educate and powerfully lead others away from prejudiced thinking and behavior, such as anti-Semitism. And this is part 17, recommendations. To start with, the authors of Israel's One-State Reality in Foreign Affairs offer several admirable suggestions for responding to Netanyahu's extremist government and Israel's system of apartheid, which I will include here. The authors call for the U.S. government to make an, quote, honest reckoning, end quote, of its responsibility in helping to create the current apartheid system. Obviously, the point is not to wallow in guilt, but to see the mistakes and then fix them with enthusiasm. The authors emphasize the importance of making military aid and funding to Israel conditional upon the behavior of the Israeli government and adherence to human rights and other aspects of international law. I would add that the entire issue of military aid should be reconsidered. There's no need for so many weapons. Let's move away from the narrow-minded notion that military security is the primary foundation of peace. The authors suggest that sanctions could also be imposed upon Israel's government until it ceases the system of apartheid, hatred, and inhumanity. The authors call upon the U.S. government to stop shielding Israel from UN condemnation for violations of international law. I would add that the U.S. government must cease its double-standard morality of condemning enemies for alleged violations of international law and excusing and funding allies who violate international law even more severely and more often. I was looking for my pen. And excusing itself for violating international law. The authors also suggest supporting both Israeli and Palestinian civil society organizations and ceasing to punish anyone who boycotts Israel while its inhumane, unjust behavior continues. Lastly, the authors suggest that accords with other nations should also be conditional upon the Israeli government's ability to uphold international law, particularly with regard to Palestinians. I would add that Israel's covert nuclear weapon program is illegal, and this must be addressed as a condition of accords, and certainly aid as well, especially military aid. In fact, all nuclear weapons are illegal now with the international movement against them. President Trump's Abraham Accords are harmful, the authors state, in that they allow for Israel to have relations with Mideastern and African nations despite Israel's system of apartheid against Palestinians. Such an agreement essentially sells out the Palestinian cause and enables Israel to get away with its ill treatment while receiving support from other nations. To put this in perspective, I think that if nations had placed similar conditions, sanctions, and condemnations against the United States during its couple of centuries of ill treatment, executions, massacres, and roundups of Native Americans, as well as its treatment of African Americans and also Asian Americans, this might have helped to prevent the social, psychological, economic, and environmental catastrophes that occurred in our nation. Such international pressure, along with positive international support for reform, would have helped give greater power to those Americans who also were appalled at the mistreatment and killing of these people. Therefore, I think in the long run, this international pressure and positive moral guidance will be appreciated by many Israelis both now and in the future, who will look back with relief that their nation was pressured to change. My focus in this memo has been on the consequences of apartheid. However, off the top of my head, I would say that solutions must encourage 360 degrees of empathy for all sides and factions. Comprehensive empathy is important, not only for understanding, but also to avoid the dynamics of sibling rivalry, which researchers find is often central to ethnic conflict. Each side wants to be seen as superior to the other and feels especially angry if the other side is seen as superior. The U.S. government should treat all groups in ways that prevent this sibling rivalry, while not necessarily putting everyone's ideas into action, giving all groups equal time to express themselves and giving all groups equal and genuine caring. So the U.S. government's tendency is the exact opposite, always to take sides, send weapons to this side to kill that side. Solutions must include 360 degrees of truth, so getting truth from all sides, all perspectives, and an enthusiastic striving by journalists, policymakers, and volunteers to find out and communicate all perspectives. I mean, wouldn't that make the news so much more interesting? I mean, it'd also be helpful to peace. which is my main point, but it also makes the news more interesting. It is with such striving and curiosity to learn more that we can better have compassion for one another, as well as caution and avoidance of some ideas and goals, and thereby find all the puzzle pieces to make them fit. Solutions must include cooperative dialogue, not merely debate, which is really verbal war, like trying to beat the other side in debate, but dialogue, in which each side presents its views strongly and clearly, but then with equal enthusiasm and sincerity sinks into the shoes of the other sides to really try to understand their fears, their reason, and their sense of humanity and justice. I mean, wouldn't it be great if our leaders were admired for their ability to get into other people's shoes, instead of their ability to make these jabs and blows to knock down the other side in argument? Even extremists on all sides who espouse hatred must be listened to in cooperative dialogues in order to better understand their fears and past wounds. Because even with them, there's going to be some positive motivations and some positive goals that can be captured and addressed. This is not a cure-all dialogue, but it will help a lot, and it will lead to better outcomes in negotiation and out in the street between people. People should not be shut out of dialogue or negotiation as a punishment. That's common tactic of the U.S. government. This is fruitless and does not advance peace or justice. Listening to people in dialogue and negotiation should not be considered a reward granted only if a nation first behaves itself in a certain designated way. Listening and conversing should be considered a tool to further understanding and to gather information and ideas. It is the terms of the dialogue and negotiation itself that determine whether a nation's or group's behavior and grievances are legitimate or illegitimate, and whether a nation or group's requests should be fulfilled. But the decision to have dialogue with them, that should be automatic. That doesn't mean, oh, you're right if we have dialogue with you. It's the first step. In terms of the paradigm for peace model, now this is a model I created shortly after 9/11. I won't describe it now. It's already described on some of my YouTube videos, which are, yeah. But I have a quick picture of the three facets of solutions, which is part of the model, and that's what I'm going to talk about here, just briefly. Instead of jumping to threats, sanctions, freezing of assets, bombs, missiles, drones, troops on the ground, we have what I call first facet mental tools. The first facet is all about human development. So these solutions involve developing our negotiation skills, communication skills, parenting skills, developing attending to values, love, worth, friendship. I won't read it all. It's about understanding history, understanding the effects of war. It's developing our minds and our relations. That's a big part of creating peace. It's completely overlooked by the government. Second facet are legal tools of justice, such as creating laws against torture, representing people and ideas, not representing money, representing people. It has to do with distribution of land, payment for resources. This is somewhat touched upon by our government, but more in a threatening way, or as a reward, like we're going to sanction you and not have trade with you unless you do what we want. But my point is you need to satisfy unfulfilled needs. Like if Palestinians' land is not being protected, we need laws to protect Palestinians' rights and a justice system to protect their rights. We need first facet tools to actually build friendships amongst Palestinians and amongst Palestinians and Israelis and the Jewish people. Then third facet is physical control. That could be violent or non-violent. So all the typical violent stuff is included here, although that tends not to promote peace at all. But you want some defense. But it also includes things, even like in a home, a third facet tool is a lock on a door, right? It helps protect you from outsiders coming in. So physical tools can help create peace. But that should not be the primary component of peace. Actually, this is the first facet. That was just a brief look at Paradigm for Peace. So, in terms of that model, the U.S. government should encourage an impartial examination of the roots of violence. That's the first part of my model, including the defensive and the aggressive roots of violence on all sides. So instead of merely looking at the defensive roots of the good guy side and the aggressive roots of violence on the bad guy side, we look at the defensive roots and the aggressive roots of this side, the defensive and the aggressive roots of that side. So with Hamas, we don't just say or think, oh, they're just malicious, evil people, the dark side. No, they've got positive motivations and understandable motivations, and you seek them out and look for them. So we look at unfulfilled needs, and I have several categories in the model that we look at. Unfulfilled needs for life and safety, big one for Palestinians. Power and freedom, another big one. I mean, they're not represented. And the different types of Palestinians aren't represented. Wealth, land, and possessions, the ability to have jobs and have their land, their homes. We look at values and identity. And that's something Hamas, I think, is more concerned about, the values and identity. And we pay attention to that. We look at needs for love, friendship, and worth. I mean, that's so important, and it's overlooked. I mean, people will commit violence because they don't feel respected. See, that it's important to give people the respect they deserve before they commit violence. Then they won't have to commit violence to gain respect. So we should look at all those as well as needs for self-potential. Such an analysis need not be a long, drawn-out process that takes months, but rather a fairly rapid process that takes only, I mean, we can talk about it in an hour, go through it all. But if you want to interview people in Israel and in the occupied territories, you could get more information. It should just take a few weeks, get additional information to add to the analysis, and most people familiar with the issues could jot down an analysis in a few hours of these roots of violence on all sides, including and the Israeli side as well. Their needs for safety and for friendship and for their values, etc. Israeli people's needs for power and freedom is big, as I said, because they're not represented by the government. That government just represents a thin sliver of the Israeli population. Mental, legal, and physical escalators of violence should be examined. That's the second part of my model. So we look at roots of violence, we look at escalators. Escalators are factors that make it more likely that violence will be chosen as a solution to the unmet needs. So just because you have an unmet need doesn't mean you're going to be violent. But certain mental, legal, and physical escalators of violence make it more likely. Mental escalators, for example, include propaganda, like big-time propaganda against Hamas, prejudice, a distorted or unhealthy sense of self-worth, preoccupations with superiority and inferiority. Those can all escalate violence and promote the decision to use violence. Legal escalators of violence include failures to impartially uphold international law and failures to uphold egalitarianism, democracy, political and economic justice, and due process within Israel and Palestinian lands. Physical escalators of violence include the heavy dependency upon weapons and brute force to try to solve problems. What a primitive, or instead of primitive, I'll just call it psychologically immature way of looking at problems and solutions. I'm not going to call it primitive because primitive people might not have thought that way. They might have been more advanced in some ways. I don't know. But there's also a lack of physical security of Palestinians, even in their homes. That's a physical escalator of violence. Israel's nuclear arsenal and huge conventional arsenal, that's an escalator of violence. The weapon shipments, it's an escalator of violence. Off the top of my head, here are a few ideas of solutions that the U.S. government could encourage or initiate itself that are categorized into the three facets of the Paradigm for Peace model. Now, the categories are there to simply help us to not forget the different approaches. So we don't need to argue about what solution goes in which facet. It's just to help us remember to think about them all. Otherwise, we might fall into the stale array of U.S. government solutions of sanctions, freezing assets, bombs, drones, and boots on the ground. And also, the point of this, of the three facets, is also to fulfill needs, not just threaten them. In fact, I would emphasize the importance of fulfilling others' needs. See, just today there was an article about a former Knesset member, Moshe Feiglin. And his impression is that he wants to firebomb Gaza, like the German city of Dresden. Level it. Expel all Palestinians into Egypt. And again, even you got to talk to people like him in cooperative dialogue, okay? But one thing he says is, you know, if we don't do it strong enough, they're just going to come back. Well, yeah, actually they will. But he's got it all wrong. The point isn't to go at them this way, it's to help them fulfill their legitimate unmet needs. That's why they're coming back fighting, because the needs aren't being met. The needs to know that your children can walk to school without getting shot. You know, the need to know that you can go to sleep in your house and your house isn't going to be bulldozed. Okay? So, the point of this paradigm for peace model and the three facets is to really emphasize fulfilling legitimate needs. And that's not appeasement. If the U.S. government is always going to consider the fulfillment of an adversary's legitimate needs as appeasement, then the U.S. is never going to be a leader who can create justice or create peace. Because it's always going to think of cooperation as appeasement. Appeasement is when you're satisfying illegitimate needs and giving away things. Or giving away things that aren't yours, like they did in Munich. So 3 facets of solutions. I'll just run through. First, here's some first facet mental tools of human development. Rather than perceiving conflict in a biased way, as good guy versus bad guy, sincerely step into each side's shoes to understand why each side sees itself as good. So we need our media makers talking about this, our policy leaders, you know, religious leaders, community leaders talking about getting rid of that good guy, bad guy look, drama, perception of conflict. It's ignorant and it's not true. Next. Help groups to understand one another. Help groups to see each other and their fears in a more positive light, while not denying or trivializing terrible behaviors. This includes stepping beyond simplistic labels and false shortcuts to knowledge of the very positive, in order to very truly grasp the positive motivations and ideals that exist within Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Islamist movements. This understanding and respect is essential to peace. That's what the U.S. government should be doing, trying to help the groups understand one another. Next, help all groups to learn about the suffering endured on all sides of the conflict, and to develop 360 degrees of empathy and a 360-degree search for truth. Help them understand what's been going on to the Palestinians since 1917. Really show them the stories, photographs, interviews, and understand Jewish suffering as well, including the suffering that led to the creation of the State of Israel. Because I think that's hanging on in the psychologies of people and being handed down maybe into certain parts of the Israeli community. Next, encourage the development of rehabilitation programs to help Israelis and Palestinians who have behaved brutally to get in their shoes and to help them regain peace of mind, a peaceful outlook, and opportunities to participate in constructive, nonviolent solutions. Okay, so we want to learn to help people understand the suffering of victims, but also learn about the perpetrators of the violence and what they've been through. They've suffered certainly morally, psychologically, and help them become better people in a positive way. Next, encourage the development of programs Here it is, to help victims of violence on all sides of conflict recover a sense of love, peace of mind, and trust in others. That's going to take a lot of effort. That's where effort should be going, into all these first facet solutions. Next, encourage those on all sides of conflict to engage in positive, cooperative ways of nonviolent conflict resolution at every front of conflict. And we've spoken about this in earlier videos. In every front of conflict with which they find themselves, and to build a capacity for these positive types of human dynamics to transfer to all levels of human relations. So help Palestinians get along with Palestinians. And use what's gained there to help Palestinians get along with Israelis. Help Israelis get along with Israelis. Use those habits gained there, transfer it to getting along with Palestinians. Next, support the initiation of prejudice reduction programs between Israelis and Palestinians and the many factions within. This should not be pushed quickly or as a demand, but suggested as a positive idea for those who are interested in participating. And I've read in some books about some prejudice reduction programs and how it can be entirely frustrating. But what I found in one, it was in Tom Friedman's book, a woman in a Harvard program. She felt so discouraged that she thought she'd been making headway, like she'd helped Palestinian and Israeli children, school children, meet, and they'd made friends. But then one boy, Palestinian, who seemed to be most interested in making friends, then later was throwing rocks with a group of Palestinians at Jews. And she was thinking, like, I'm hitting a wall here. But the thing is, she then talked to him. And then he learned that she was Jewish. He never knew that his teacher was Jewish. And then he brought her all these strawberries as an apology the next day. He said, you really taught me something. So it wasn't all her instruction that really helped. It was their relationship. It was an indirect way of overcoming prejudice that made a difference. And I also think that the reason he got into the rock throwing is because he liked doing things with people. Like, he liked making friends with the Israeli kids. He liked throwing rocks with the Palestinians. So if there could be some kind of positive, fun activity to do, that would help. Studies have shown that indirect programs in which people from opposing groups are working on a project or activity together towards another goal are often more effective than direct instruction against prejudice. You know, like where you're getting hit over the head and told, you should be thinking this way. Without forgetting past horrors experienced by Jews, and without encouraging anti-Semitism, dislodge the biased perception that Israel is a lamb surrounded by wolves. That's what I remember hearing in Sunday school. You get that impression. I mean, think of them all as lambs. Don't think of it as a lamb surrounded by wolves. Okay, think of them all as lambs in need of help, in need of shepherding and becoming friends. Next, educate Americans on the variety of opinions and fronts of conflict within Israel and the need for these perspectives to be represented in Israel's government in order to truly support the Israeli people. Educate Americans on the fronts of conflict amongst Palestinians and the need for these perspectives to be represented in government. Next, educate Americans on how one humanitarian disaster replaced another, when the suffering of Jews, Romani, Slavs, and others in the Holocaust was replaced by the suffering of Palestinians, a people that had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Next, educate Americans on the difference between supporting the Israeli people and supporting their government, when that government is unrepresentative of the people, but representative instead of one slice of the population, including those ideologically descended from the Hitler-admiring revisionists and those who believe Israel must be larger in order for people to be, quote, spiritually complete. And we spoke about the revisionists in an earlier video. Next, educate Americans to not be gullible to the drama that the U.S. government is a noble hero rescuing freedom, democracy, and innocent victims from evil persecutors against whom it must use weapons. Next, encourage 360 degrees of impartial, comprehensive reporting in the U.S., Israel, Palestine, and worldwide. That would be so exciting. Next, encourage solution-oriented, vibrant journalism, where journalists interview people from all walks of life, not only leaders and official sources, in order to gather solution ideas and pieces to the puzzle of peace. Encourage and give the spotlight to Israeli and Palestinian civil society groups that hope to improve culture and justice at a grassroots level. Address dynamics of sibling rivalry and superiority and inferiority within cultures and subcultures on all levels of society. Don't have a favorite son or a favored nation. Don't view conflict as good guy versus bad guy. Help all groups to feel appreciated, valuable, and loved. That's how you create peace. That's how you create peace in a family, and on a street, in a neighborhood, in a school. We've got to do that in our schools. The hierarchy in the schools of cliques, it's just awful. The emphasis on who's superior and inferior, whether it's through grades or popularity or sports. Encourage feelings of self-worth and national worth that do not depend upon superiority. Support cooperative dialogue with a variety of groups from all perspectives, including Hamas and Hezbollah, Jewish extremists, Palestinian and Jewish moderates, and Palestinian and Jewish peace groups. Last, don't exclude anyone from dialogue and negotiation. Second facet, legal tools of justice. Impartially uphold international law and the UN Charter. Ensure that Israel, the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority, and Hamas are held accountable to international law. Okay, don't take favorites on any side. Keep them all accountable to international law. Give all people a non-violent means to voice their grievances before an attentive, effective audience so that they don't feel the need to resort to violence. Protect those who voice grievances. See, why can't the Palestinians voice their grievances and be protected? Why can't journalists report on it without having to fear they're going to be killed? Make aid to Israel conditional upon Israel's adherence to international law, dismantling of the system of apartheid, lifting of the blockade on Gaza, the cessation of illegal settlements and in getting rid of them, not in a violent way either though, the discontinuation of the occupation of Palestinian territory, the creation of positive, caring relations towards Palestinians, and the protection of all journalists. Such pressure can also help Netanyahu stand up to the extremists of his coalition. Make Israel's cooperative agreements with surrounding nations conditional upon Israel's adherence to international law, as stated above. Restore all rights to Palestinians, including due process and other legal, economic, political, cultural, and social rights, and including rights in Gaza to move in and out of their land, to have water, electricity, medical care, etc., and including ease of transportation to visit other Palestinians, because these Palestinians are just like in pockets where they can't even travel to one another. Communicate with Palestinian leaders to inform them of the restoration of their rights and of their new responsibilities to adhere to international law, cease violence, and encourage cultures of peace. Because you want them to know of the changes being made, if these changes are in fact being made. Encourage representation of all groups within a 2-state or 1-state or 6-state, whatever, solution. Stress the importance of not allowing one narrow slice of the population to impose their views upon the entire population. Ensure representation of underrepresented groups, but be careful not to cause those groups who've been overrepresented in the past to feel out in the cold. Don't exclude them. Keep a path open for them to show their humanity and impartial sense of justice. Encourage and teach cooperative dialogue within executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, using talented facilitators and trainers. Get talent in there for this. as well as within other settings such as colleges, schools, and neighborhoods. I suggest that. So some of these solutions I suggest for the United States as well, including that one. Strongly discourage human dynamics of domination. Discourage the creation of governments in which those Israelis and Palestinians come to power who like to dominate those of another religion, ethnicity, political group, and those of their own religion, ethnicity, and political group. With regard to the U.S. government, publicly stand up to AIPAC. Communicate to the American public AIPAC's degree of control over elections and foreign policy, and AIPAC's ideology. Don't allow AIPAC to overrepresent its narrow group of supporters, and don't allow AIPAC or anyone else to purchase policymakers and policies. This is undemocratic. We've got to stop the campaign contributions, and campaigns shouldn't require wealth to win. It's not constitutional. It's not democratic. Determine whether any U.S. aid to Israel is used to support AIPAC. Give other Jewish groups and Palestinian groups more time to communicate with legislators. Really put a microphone to the voices of American and Israeli Jews whose perspectives are not like Netanyahu, his extremist government, and the Likud party. Suggest using political borders if needed to separate groups that wish to have greater or complete autonomy. Not only the major groups of Israelis and Palestinians, but also religious or political sects within those groups. Do not make the traditional U.S. government mistake of allowing desires for strategic alliances against rivals to cause the U.S. government to abandon ship on principles. For example, the U.S. government should not overlook the Israeli government's violations of international law and its system of apartheid in order to have a loyal ally against Iran, Russia, or China. Instead, the U.S. government should condemn Israel's violations, and with regard to its adversaries, it should seek cooperative dialogue and cooperative, integrative negotiation with these so-called enemies. Abandoning ship on principles such as suppressing nationalism in northern Africa in order to support World War I and World War II imperialist allies, or violating Iran's and Iraq's sovereignty and neutrality during World War II by invading them to access their oil, all for the allegedly greater goal of winning a war, always leads to humanitarian disasters and behaviors of extreme injustice, as does the war itself. And lastly, we come to third facet, physical tools of physical control, which can involve physical control methods of peace. Could involve having a weapon if you need to defend yourself. But often these days, the worst problem is having too many weapons around, and having a habit of relying on them. So, dismantle nuclear weapons and or require inspections of Israeli nukes. Do not have double standards of merely allowing Israel to have 80 or so covert nukes, considering it sensibly appropriate for the U.S. to have 4,000 overt nukes, and then insisting that North Korea is an evil menace for having 12, and Iran should never be allowed to have 1. Focus on dismantling the U.S. nuclear arsenal. 4,000 is overkill. Focus, 1 nuke is overkill. Focus on dismantling Israel's arsenal. It makes Muslims and Arabs nervous. I mean, they want to have, I think it was Saddam Hussein in Iraq was trying to have a nuclear-free zone in the Mideast. Latin America, Brazil's president was trying to do that. And whenever anyone tries to do that, the U.S. government doesn't like them. Reduce military aid to Israel. Make Israel learn to create peace and security without the heavy third facet dependence on weapons. Even at the time of Israel's creation, had the emphasis been upon first facet relations between Jews and Muslims and Arabs, rather than upon second facet pieces of signed papers, and laws, and third facet secret armies and militaries, there would have been a much greater chance of peace. You know, even if they insisted on creating Israel there, had they focused on the first facet, as Henrietta wanted to do. I mentioned that in an earlier video. Henrietta Sold, S-Z-O-L-D, believed in a binational, she was a Zionist, binational Zionist. Do not have so-called special relationships with nations such as Israel and Saudi Arabia, where U.S. weapons seem to be traded in exchange for these nations doing the U.S. President's bidding in other parts of the world behind the backs of the U.S. Congress and American people. Encourage and insist upon significant and continued human rights training and monitoring of Israeli and Palestinian troops, prison guards, and interrogators. Monitor behavior and hold individuals accountable to law. Help instill caring for the dignity of all people within Israeli and Palestinian and American culture. And I would add to that, when you're holding these troops, guards, and interrogators responsible to adhere to human rights laws, you want to train them in a positive way where the relationship with them is also positive. I don't mean positive in the sense of being lax, like, oh yeah, if you break that law, I'm not going to report you. I don't mean that as being positive. I mean being support the law, but be positive towards them and towards their spirits, and be a positive coach for them to bring out the best in them. A really positive teacher, not a scolding type of teacher to them. Otherwise they kind of learn a bad type of human relations. So it's important how they're trained. And that is the conclusion of the memo that I was asked to write this past June. And I finished it on June 28th, and I've been wanting to talk about it, and I decided now it was time to film it, and I hope it's somehow of help. I hope I'll get the written parts posted, I hope, somewhere, so you can find the sources if you want to. But thank you very, very much for your attention and for caring and for your thoughtfulness. It's now 6 a.m. We went through the night on this and through supper and lunch. So I'm going to go get something to eat and hit the sack. And I hope, I really hope these ideas can help you and help you to help the situation in Gaza and in the United States and all parts of the world, so that we don't have the hate towards the Muslims and the Islamists, the Arabs, the Palestinians, and so we don't have the hate towards the Jewish people all around the world. Most people want peace. It's just that people who get in power, somehow the mechanism to get in power seems to attract or allow certain types to get in power, and then wealth gets in there too. But most people want peace, and people, Jewish people and Muslims and the Islamists who are called extremists, so many of them, they just want freedom from oppression. They don't want their families and loved ones being killed. That's the same with the people in Gaza. When it comes down to it, most people just don't want their loved ones being killed. So I hope we can all care about each other. Thank you. Good night.